I live in a typical suburban neighborhood. Rows of identical houses with driveways, trimmed lawns, and the occasional over-the-top Christmas decoration. This time of year, the street feels magical, almost picturesque. Every house is adorned with string lights, inflatable Santas, and glowing reindeer. It's the kind of place where kids ride their bikes in the summer and everyone waves at each other, even if you barely know their name. My next-door neighbors, the Hendricks, moved in earlier this year. They seemed nice, quiet, kept to themselves. But as December rolled in, something about them began to feel off. They didn't put up decorations, which isn't strange on its own, but in this neighborhood, it stood out. It's like they weren't part of the unspoken agreement to play along with the holiday spirit. On December 18th, a strange thing happened. I came home late from work, past 10 p.m., and noticed their house glowing. Not Christmas lights, exactly. Their windows were lit with a faint red hue, like the entire house was bathed in the light of a dying sunset. It wasn't the warm, cozy glow of candles or lamps. It was cold and unnatural, almost pulsing. I told myself they'd probably set up some new decorations, maybe one of those laser projectors that cast patterns on your house. Still, it felt wrong. No one else on the street had that eerie red glow. The next night, the glow was back, stronger. It spilled out onto their driveway and onto the snow-covered lawn. When I walked past, I could feel the faintest vibration in my chest, like when you're near heavy bass at a concert. But there was no sound, just that vibrating hum. I texted my wife, Abby, about it. She was out of town visiting her sister, but promised to be home by Christmas Eve. Probably just new neighbors being weird, she wrote. I didn't respond. It didn't feel like something I could explain over text. The following night, December 20th, I decided to investigate. It was snowing lightly, and I had just gotten home from grocery shopping. The glow was back, brighter than ever. I walked over to their house under the pretense of borrowing sugar or something equally mundane. As I got closer, the hum grew stronger, like it was alive, vibrating in my teeth. Before I could knock, the door creaked open, just a sliver. There was no one there. Hello? I called, my voice swallowed by the strange quiet of the street. No response. I stepped back, uneasy, and noticed something else. Their driveway was spotless, completely devoid of snow. Everywhere else on the street, there was at least 3 inches of fresh powder, but not a single flake clung to their house. The snow seemed to melt into nothingness as it touched the ground near their door. I hurried back inside my house, locking the door behind me. December 21st. The glow hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. Now it wasn't just their windows. Red streaks began appearing on their lawn, cutting through the snow like molten scars. It looked like something was moving underneath. Around 9 p.m., I heard it. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Singing Christmas carols. Except the voices weren't cheerful. They were low, dissonant, almost mournful. It sounded like dozens of people whispering at once, struggling to stay in harmony. I peeked out the window. A group of figures stood in front of the Hendricks house, lined up in perfect formation. Their heads were bowed, their hands clasped. They didn't wear coats, scarves, or anything you'd expect on a freezing December night. Just pale clothing that seemed to shimmer faintly in the red glow. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. They sang, or whispered, or whatever it was, for what felt like an eternity. Then, as one, their heads snapped toward me. I ducked back behind the curtain, my heart pounding. Had they seen me? No, I told myself. It's too dark. A knock at my door. I froze. My house was dark except for the soft glow of the Christmas tree. No one should have known I was home. I crept to the door, looking through the peephole. Nothing. Just the snow swirling in the red-tinted night. Then the knock came again, louder this time. Slow, rhythmic. 3 beats. A pause. 3 beats again. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't coming from the front door anymore. It was coming from the back. I didn't sleep that night. The knocks eventually stopped, but the glow didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the hum, felt it vibrating in my chest. And worse, I could still hear the singing, soft, distant, but there. December 23rd. The Hendricks house went dark. No glow, no hum, no singing, just darkness. Relieved, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe they'd left, or the weird decorations had been taken down. But when I stepped outside that evening, I noticed something else. Every single house on the street had a light in the window, except for mine. A single candle, glowing faintly gold. It was a neighborhood tradition, something we all did for Christmas. I could have sworn I lit mine the night before. But now, my window was dark. And then I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They led from my front door to the Hendricks house, then back again. They weren't human either. Too long, too thin, with claw-like impressions where toes should have been. As I write this, I'm sitting in my living room with every light in the house on. Abby's flight got delayed because of the weather. She won't be home until Christmas morning. I don't know what's happening, but just now, I saw them again. Those figures, standing in my yard, watching, silent, and the candle in the Hendricks window just lit itself. I live in a mid-rise apartment building in the city, nothing fancy but cozy enough. It's the kind of place where you nod politely to your neighbors, but rarely exchange more than a few words. The hallways are bland, gray carpeting, beige walls, a faint scent of stale air. This year, the building's management decided to spruce things up for the holidays. On December 1st, a modest fake Christmas tree appeared in the lobby. It was small, with mismatched ornaments and a crooked star, but it added a bit of charm. Over the next couple of weeks, I noticed similar trees popping up in the hallways on each floor. I live on the 4th, and ours was placed near the elevator, right across from my door. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. It was just a cheap plastic tree with generic ornaments. But by December 19th, I started to notice something strange. Every time I walked past the tree, it looked slightly different. An ornament would be out of place, or the lights would flicker in an odd, uneven rhythm. One evening, as I came home late from work, I swore I saw something reflected in one of the shiny red baubles. Something that wasn't me. It was quick, just a flicker of movement, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Maintenance probably just didn't secure it properly. I muttered to myself, brushing off the unease. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the tree was off. December 20th. The tree had changed again. This time, it was taller. Noticeably taller. I could have sworn it was only about 5 feet tall when they first put it up, but now, it loomed closer to 7. The star on top was gone, replaced by something else. A strange, misshapen ornament that looked like it had been hastily crafted from sticks and twine. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, before shaking my head and heading inside. Probably just imagining things, I told myself. That night, I woke up to a soft rustling sound outside my door. I glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. The hallway was usually silent at that hour, so the noise immediately set me on edge. It sounded like branches brushing against the wall. I got up and peeked through the peephole. The tree was closer. It had been moved from its spot near the elevator and was now directly in front of my door. Its branches swayed ever so slightly, even though the hallway was sealed from any drafts. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to explain what I was seeing. Eventually, I backed away from the door and climbed into bed, heart racing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. December 21st. The tree was back in its usual spot when I left for work. I felt stupid for being so rattled the night before, but as I passed it, I noticed something new. There were small, handmade ornaments hanging among the generic store-bought ones. They looked like crude little figures, made of twigs bound with string. Each one was tied with a strip of red fabric that looked disturbingly like torn cloth. One of the ornaments had a face drawn on it. a face that looked eerily familiar. My face. I hurried to the elevator, trying to ignore the growing pit of dread in my stomach. That evening, I got home late again, exhausted from a long day. As I stepped out of the elevator, the first thing I noticed was the smell. The hallway reeked of pine, overpowering, almost suffocating. The tree was back in front of my door, and this time, there was no mistaking it. It had grown even taller. The top of it now scraped the ceiling, and its branches were unnaturally thick, almost pulsing with life. I stood frozen, staring at it, when I heard a faint creaking sound. The tree moved. One of its branches shifted slightly, like an arm reaching toward me. I fumbled with my keys, heart pounding, and shoved my way inside. That night, the noises started again. Rustling, creaking, and something else. Soft whispers, too faint to make out. I didn't dare look through the peephole this time. I grabbed my phone and called building management, but no one answered. I considered calling the police, but what would I even tell them? A Christmas tree is stalking me? I'd sound insane. I barely slept, jumping at every noise, every creak of the floorboards. December 22nd. I woke up to find pine needles scattered in front of my door. Not just a few, hundreds of them. Like the tree had been shedding itself. The ornaments had changed again. Now, they were all the handmade kind, each one resembling someone in the building. I recognized my neighbor from 4B, the old woman from 3C, even the mailman. And right in the center of the tree, where the star should have been, was an ornament of me. This one was more detailed than the others. It had my features, my clothes, even the small scar on my left cheek from a childhood accident. I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. I ran back inside and locked every door and window. December 23rd. The tree was gone. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Maybe management had finally taken it down. But as I left for work, I noticed something else. My neighbor from 4B wasn't answering his door. Neither was the old woman from 3C. The hallway felt emptier. That night, I heard the rustling again. This time, it was coming from inside my apartment. I turned on every light, clutching a kitchen knife as I searched the rooms. When I reached the living room, I froze. The tree was there, taller than ever, its branches filling the room, its ornaments swaying gently. The figure at the top, the one that looked like me, was no longer just an ornament. It was me. My face stared down at me from the top of the tree, mouth slightly open as if it were trying to scream. The lights on the tree flickered once, twice, and then everything went dark. It happened 2 nights before Christmas. I was on the subway, heading home from work. The train was half empty, just the way I liked it. Most people had already left the city for the holidays, so the usual rush hour chaos was nowhere to be found. It was just me, a few other passengers, and the sound of the train rattling down the tracks. The decorations in the subway stations had gone up a few weeks earlier. Cheap tinsel strung along the walls, faded posters advertising holiday events, and the occasional cutout of a smiling Santa. I always thought it was a bit pathetic, but tonight it felt oddly comforting. It was cold and dark outside, and the warmth of the train and the faint hum of the holiday decorations gave the ride a kind of cozy normalcy. I was scrolling through my phone when I noticed him. He was sitting at the far end of the car, just a few seats away. I hadn't seen him board, which was strange because I'd been paying attention when the train pulled into the last station. He was dressed as Santa, red suit, white beard, the whole deal. But something about him was off. His suit looked old and dusty, like it hadn't been washed in years. His beard wasn't the fluffy, fake kind you'd see on mall Santas. It was tangled and yellowed, like it had been pulled off some old costume in a thrift shop. He wasn't looking at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was aware of me, somehow. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching slightly, as if he was waiting for something. I told myself not to be paranoid. It's Christmas, I thought. Maybe he's just some guy on his way to a holiday party. Or maybe he's drunk. That would explain the weird vibe. I went back to my phone, determined not to let it bother me. When the train pulled into the next station, a family got on. A mom, dad, and a little girl no older than 5. The girl was dressed in a puffy pink coat, her mittened hands clutching a stuffed reindeer. She looked around the car with wide, curious eyes, and when she spotted the man in the Santa suit, her face lit up. "Santa!" she squealed, tugging on her dad's sleeve. "It's Santa!" Her parents exchanged a glance, clearly uneasy, but they didn't stop her when she ran over to him. I wanted to say something, to tell them to hold her back, but I stayed quiet. I didn't want to seem crazy. The man's head tilted slightly as the girl approached. He didn't smile or speak, but he raised one hand and extended it toward her. His fingers were long and thin, the nails yellowed and cracked. The girl hesitated for a moment, then held out her reindeer like an offering. "Do you like him?" she asked. "His name's Rudy." For a long moment, the man didn't move. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, his face almost level with hers. "Rudy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. What a lovely name. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. The girl's parents finally stepped in, pulling her away with murmured apologies. The man didn't react. He just sat back in his seat, his head tilting again, like he was listening to something only he could hear. As the train rattled on, I tried to focus on anything else. The hum of the lights, the sound of the wheels on the tracks, but my attention kept drifting back to him. His presence filled the car, heavy and suffocating. At the next stop, the family got off. I almost followed them, but I didn't want to wait for the next train in the freezing cold. I told myself I was being ridiculous. He hadn't done anything. He was just a guy in a creepy costume. The doors slid shut, and the train lurched forward again. It was just me and him now. I kept my eyes on my phone, pretending to scroll, but I was hyper-aware of his every movement. He hadn't shifted much since the family left, but his fingers were still twitching, like he was tapping out a rhythm only he could hear. At the next stop, the train didn't pick up any new passengers. The doors opened and closed, and we rattled on. I glanced up, just for a second, and froze. He was looking at me. His eyes were dark and sunken, his pupils so small they were almost invisible. His face was pale, almost gray, and his lips were cracked and dry. But it was his expression that terrified me. A kind of hollow, joyless smile that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, I noticed the bag at his feet. It was large and lumpy, tied shut with frayed rope. "I have a gift for you," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the train like a knife. I didn't respond. My throat was dry, my heart pounding. He reached down, his long fingers curling around the bag. The rope came undone with a single tug, and something heavy thudded against the floor. "Come closer," he said. I stood, gripping the metal pole for balance. I didn't know what I was doing. Fight, flight, or freeze all seemed like bad options, but my body acted on its own. I moved toward the door, my eyes darting to the emergency intercom. "Don't leave," he said, his voice almost sing-song. "It's Christmas. Stay a while." The bag tipped over, and something rolled out, a small, round object. It took me a moment to realize what it was. A child's toy, a stuffed reindeer, its fabric soaked and dark. The train screeched to a halt. The lights flickered, then went out entirely. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city beyond the tunnel walls. When the emergency lights flickered on, he was gone. The bag was gone. I stumbled out of the car at the next station, heart racing. I told the attendant what happened, but they just looked at me like I was insane. "There's no one else in that car," they said. "We checked the cameras. They showed me the footage. The train car was empty. No Santa, no bag, no reindeer. But I know what I saw. And last night, when I got home, there was something waiting for me on my kitchen table, a stuffed reindeer. Its tag read, Rudy." I've always been a late shopper when it comes to Christmas. Every year, I promise myself I'll get my shopping done early, but by mid-December, I'm still scrambling. This year was no different. On December 22nd, I was on my laptop, frantically trying to find something for my niece, Emma. She's 5 and obsessed with stuffed animals, so I figured a cute, handmade plushie from an online boutique would do the trick. I found the perfect one, a little gray fox with button eyes and a scarf. The site promised next-day delivery if I ordered within the hour, so I clicked "Buy now" and hoped for the best. The next morning, December 23rd, the package was already on my doorstep. It was a plain brown box with no return address, just my name written in neat black ink. I figured it must have been some sort of local seller who didn't bother with professional packaging. When I opened it, I froze. Inside was the gray fox plushie, exactly as I'd seen online. But something about it felt wrong. The button eyes were slightly uneven, and the scarf wasn't the cheerful red and green I'd expected. It was frayed and dark, almost black. And the fabric of the plushie wasn't soft like I'd imagined. It felt rough, almost like old burlap. Attached to it was a note, handwritten on yellowed paper. "Return to sender." I stared at it, confused. It didn't make sense. Why would the seller send me this? I considered emailing them to complain, but I was busy with work and figured I'd deal with it later. I wrapped the fox in shiny paper and tucked it under the tree, thinking Emma wouldn't notice the details. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the fox. The way its uneven eyes seemed to follow me when I'd wrapped it. The way its scarf almost looked like it had been tied too tightly around its neck. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise. It was faint at first, a soft thud, like something falling over. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Then it came again, louder this time. It was coming from the living room. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably nothing, just the heater kicking on or the tree settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got up, grabbing the baseball bat I kept under my bed, and crept toward the living room. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights. When I stepped into the room, I froze. The presents under the tree were scattered across the floor as if someone, or something, had been rifling through them. And in the center of the chaos was the fox. It wasn't wrapped anymore. It sat upright, its button eyes gleaming in the multicolored glow of the tree lights. The scarf was still tied tightly around its neck, but now the ends were frayed even more, as if they'd been pulled. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe I hadn't wrapped it properly, or maybe the wrapping paper had torn on its own. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. I picked up the fox and tossed it back in the box, shoving it into the corner of the room. Then I went back to bed, telling myself I'd deal with it in the morning. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was check the box. I wanted to make sure the fox was still there, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But the box was empty. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I searched the entire house, but the fox was nowhere to be found. Then I noticed the note. It was sitting on the coffee table, where I'd left my mug the night before. It was the same yellowed paper, but the message had changed. "You should have returned it." I stared at the note, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? Tell them what? That a creepy plushie was haunting me? They'd think I was insane. I decided to get rid of it. I went to the hardware store, bought a metal trash bin, and set it up in the backyard. That night, I gathered all the wrapping paper, the box, and the fox itself, which I finally found sitting on my bed, and threw them into the bin. Then I lit a match. The flames crackled and roared, but the fox didn't burn. The paper and the box turned to ash almost immediately, but the plushie just sat there, untouched by the fire. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, every creak of the house, set me on edge. I kept thinking about the fox, how it had sat in the flames, untouched, like it was taunting me. On Christmas Eve, I woke up to find another box on my doorstep. This one was larger than the first, wrapped in plain brown paper with a bow made of frayed black string. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct told me to leave it alone. But I had to know. Inside was a new plushie. This one was a rabbit, with long, floppy ears and a patch over one eye. Its fur was the same rough, burlap-like material as the fox, and tied around its neck was a scarf, frayed and dark. There was another note inside. "Merry Christmas." I live alone in a small house at the edge of town. It's quiet, surrounded by woods, and usually, I love the solitude. But Christmas can feel a little lonely when you're by yourself. This year, I decided to stay home instead of traveling to see family. I told myself it would be relaxing, a break from all the chaos, but by December 24th, I was regretting it. The day was uneventful. I spent most of it baking cookies and watching old Christmas movies, trying to force myself into the holiday spirit. By the time night fell, the snow had started coming down hard, and the world outside was blanketed in white. It was beautiful, but the silence felt heavy. I turned on some Christmas music to fill the void. Around 9 p.m., I was finishing up the dishes when I heard it, singing. It was faint, almost drowned out by the music playing inside. At first, I thought it might be coming from a neighbor's house, but that didn't make sense. My nearest neighbor was half a mile away. I turned off the music and stood still, listening. The singing continued. It was coming from outside. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. There, standing in the snow, was a man. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit and a long coat, with a top hat perched on his head. He was singing a Christmas carol, something slow and haunting, the words almost lost in the howling wind. At first, I was startled. Carolers weren't exactly common out here, and certainly not at this hour. But he didn't seem threatening. In fact, he barely seemed to notice me at all. He just stood there, staring at the house, his voice carrying softly through the night. I watched him for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then I grabbed my coat and opened the door. "Can I help you?" I called out, stepping onto the porch. The man stopped singing and turned to face me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were dark, sunken hollows. But it wasn't just his appearance that unsettled me. It was the way he stood, perfectly still, like a statue. "Do you need something?" I asked again, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. He didn't respond. Instead, he began to sing again, louder this time. His voice was beautiful, but there was something wrong about it. The melody was strange, the words unfamiliar, like a carol from another time. "Silent night, holy night." His voice cracked slightly, but the song continued. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "If you're lost or need help, I can call someone," I said, my voice shaking. The man stopped again, tilting his head slightly, as if considering my words. Then he smiled, a slow, eerie grin that didn't reach his eyes, and pointed to the window behind me. I turned instinctively, my heart racing. The lights in my living room flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. The house plunged into darkness. When I turned back to the man, he was gone. I locked the door and spent the next hour pacing the house, jumping at every creak and shadow. I checked all the windows and doors twice, making sure everything was secure. But the man didn't come back. Around midnight, I finally started to calm down. I told myself it was just a random stranger, maybe someone drunk or lost in the storm. By then, the power had come back on, and the house felt warm and safe again. I was just about to head to bed when I heard it. A knock at the window. It was soft at first, almost polite. But when I didn't respond, it came again, louder this time. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the living room window. I couldn't see anything through the thick curtain, but I knew someone was there. The knock came again, steady and insistent, summoning what little courage I had. I walked to the window and yanked the curtain aside. There was no one there, just the snow falling in the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, feeling equal parts relieved and foolish. But as I turned to go, I noticed something. A single set of footprints in the snow, leading from the woods to my window. They were deep, impossibly long, and they didn't lead away. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the living room, every light in the house blazing, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon. The snowstorm raged outside, and the wind howled against the windows, but nothing else happened. By morning, the footprints had vanished, covered by fresh snow. I tried to tell myself it was over, that the caroler, whoever or whatever he was gone. But when I went to the kitchen to make coffee, I found something waiting for me on the counter. A piece of paper, old and yellowed, with a single line written in neat, looping handwriting. "I'll be back for the next verse." That night, I left. I packed a bag, got in my car, and drove to my sister's house, ignoring the worsening storm. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt my stomach drop. The man was standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. His lips moved silently, as if singing a song I couldn't hear.